Hello and welcome. I'm Kat Pullen, the Marketing Director here at Ontracks, and I'd like to thank you for attending the latest installment of our monthly webinar series. We're going to be recording today's presentation, and I'll make that available on our website. Today, we're going to be discussing an easy way to rename Maximo IDs. The Ontracks MaxEdit Rename Tool is a built-in Maximo add-on that renames key records directly from inside Maximo using the Maximo user interface. It's a common and almost inevitable problem most Maximo installations face, especially as the systems get older and business units get added, organizations change or corrections need to be made to locations, assets, companies, etc. inside Maximo. At some point, you're going to want to change its name or ID. Joining me today to give an overview and presentation is Frank Vanderham, a principal consultant here at Ontracks. Frank has been performing Maximo implementations, upgrades, and integration projects for well over a decade in various industries such as oil and gas, energy, and utilities. In addition, he also manages the product development of various software add-ons, such as MaxEdit, that we market and sell directly to the Maximo community. I will now turn this over to Frank.
As Kat mentioned, I'm with Ontracks Consulting. I've been doing Maximo for quite a bit of time, involved in implementations, and as Kat mentioned, I also oversee the internal product development and utilities that we provide into the market. Let's just get going into the agenda. So today we're going to talk about the need and benefits of renaming records within Maximo. We'll start out by some common causes and why people have this need in the first place. We're also obviously talking about why it's important to keep your Maximo records up to date. And we'll talk a little bit about why is this a big deal to begin with. What is really the complexity with renaming records from a Maximo perspective. We'll do an introduction to the MaxEdit Rename Tool, and we'll after the introduction, probably the latter half of this webcast will be spent with an actual live demonstration of the tool. And of course, after that, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A with the people that are participating in this webcast. So let's start at the beginning here. So how are your Maximo records named today? Well, today they're typically named during the initial implementation of Maximo. So, and this may have been many, many years ago. At the time, there may have been a misunderstanding, or there may have been a very well understanding of how you should be naming your records, and at the time that may have made a lot of sense. To represent things like your location hierarchy. You may have had an organizational breakdown structure, from area, facility, unit, plant, and so on and so forth. And at the time, that made a lot of sense to put that into your location hierarchy. Also, things like items and inventory, you may have made the choice to either auto-number or not auto-number your items. You may have made a choice to implement some kind of naming standard at the time. Company records are also a common, area of interest when we're dealing with renames is you may have at the time built a company master based on names, but later introduced an ERP system that had a different naming convention or went through a numbering or a BA numbering system. And of course, your assets. You may have had a different, at the time, an asset naming convention that worked, that fit the organization, and that's how you started naming your assets. So what are the reasons for people wanting to make changes to this? One is data entry mistakes. That does happen. It's less of an issue, of course, structurally. You would hope that over time with training or at least, throughout the year, this happens very minimally. But the more common reasons for renaming that we find is things like acquisitions or divestments. You may have acquired a facility that was already running Maximo. They have, at the time they implemented, they used a very different naming convention than yourself, or you split off a piece of the organization, and with that you wanted to change the naming convention. a business realignment. You may have had a situation where in Maximo you implemented it for different facilities in a different way. Each facility was allowed to create their own naming convention, and now you're deciding to realign the business, maybe amalgamate the maintenance organization or the procurement supply chain organization, and you really want to focus on naming things consistently throughout the organization. Similarly, if you used to have, for example, an asset naming convention, but you want to adopt a different standard, or the standard has changed, you now need to update those records. We run into a lot of cases where people are upgrading or migrating Maximo, and that is kind of the impetus of changing things the way they've done it in the past, or it is a migration of another system into Maximo. We've seen this a lot, which is very similar, I guess, to the acquisition divestment. But if you have different Maximo systems that exist within the organization and you want to merge them into a single one, and you want to at the time adopt a single location hierarchy or asset hierarchy or item master or a company master. Adding integration to an older existing Maximo system or integration in general is a common cause for having to rename records within Maximo. So, of course, you can decide not to do that, and some of the business benefits of keeping these records up to date are kind of your justification of maybe going down the path of renaming or realigning, because whether you like it or not, there is a opportunity or even an investment associated to making that choice. Is, you know, the benefits of doing it is it allows you to standardize business processes. It, of course, proper naming avoids confusion and data entry error. I'd say one of the primary objectives in a maintenance organization, or what are the growth metrics as you go from perhaps not best practice to a better practice, is one of the key things I hear a lot, is that ensuring that work orders are coded at the right place, the right location. And, of course, having the right name is kind of your first step in that. That's how you're going to ensure that work orders are actually coded at the right place. Also tracking cost and financial information at the proper level, having alignment between how you roll up costs in the organization and how you capture that information at the work order or at the supply chain level. And, of course, standardizing naming with third parties, such as vendors, contractors, on the compliance side, safety, reliability. You generally speaking want to have your records have a linkage or are called identical to how you name those records with the other parties. So now back to the problem. Okay, so you've decided you need to rename, and there's a business driver to rename. How do you do that? And, of course, the first thing you will run into is that Maximo doesn't allow you to rename these records. And the reason for that is we'll get into a little bit of technical, not too much here, but it is important to illustrate this as to why there is a cost involved in doing renames. Is one of the reasons is Maximo is not a fully normalized database, and I have a slide on that hopefully explains it a little better than that. But Maximo has several tables that reference these named fields, these key fields, such as locations, items, and so on. The Maximo database, from an IT perspective, is not a normalized database. Maximo relationships are handled at the application level, not at the database level, and hopefully this slide will explain this a little bit better. So in the Maximo system, let's say we have the locations table or the locations object here, and we have a particular PMP-100, which has a location identifier, a description, a status, and so on and so forth. If we use that location on the work order, we would create a work order, and on that work order, which has its own work order number, that location will be labeled at the work order level with that exact same name, so PMP-100. That work order is stored in a database. It may live forever. It may live many, many years. And if, of course, what this means is that if we choose to rename the original location PMP-100 to something else, we would have to go and revisit the work order table as well and ensure that that data integrity is maintained. So in a normalized database, and again, if you're IT-oriented, this may be one of the questions that I typically get is, why is this even an issue with Maximo? Because in a normalized database, you wouldn't have that problem. So if we have like a fictitious this is not how Maximo works, but just to illustrate that, if Maximo was set up differently and there was a locations table where the location was just a field and the location itself was identified by some numeric number, and more importantly, if I use that location on the work order, instead of copying the location name, it would only copy in the location identifier, then we would be free to rename that location at any point from PMP 100 to anything else, and we wouldn't have to go back to the work order and update that. Again, the reason we're having this discussion today and why we have utilities and discussions about this is because that's not, unfortunately, how Maximo works. So the way Maximo works is instead of using this at the database level, it uses this at the application level. And there are some very significant benefits to that approach, though. So the benefit is that there is no dependency on what kind of database Maximo is running on, which is one of the primary key aspects of Maximo, of course. They don't have to worry about all the nuances and technical details at the database level. It is also, the downside of that, of course, is that the referential integrity must be handled by the application, and this is exactly what Maximo does really well. It also allows you, of course, to have long-term tracking of the location identifiers that once a location is named one way, it can never be changed. And in some organizations, that is actually a very important aspect of this, right? So just to be clear, there are organizations where once a work order has been coded at one location and with one name, they would never allow that location to be renamed, whether they like it or not. Okay, so Maximo doesn't actually allow you to do renames. So now what possible means do you have to perform that rename? And your options really are, well, don't. This is kind of the base approach is you can't, so you won't. So you're going to have to learn to live with the old record, perhaps create a new record and start, creating work orders, assets, locations at that new record, of course. This is a very common one, is you build a custom SQL update script to update these records, so you'd have a smart person who understands how the Maximo database works in all its nuances and write a SQL script. And this is very common. This happens a lot. Of course, you can have this done by a third party, somebody who understands professionally how the Maximo database works, and you don't necessarily want to get into that from an investment perspective. Or you can use the MaxEdit tool that we'll be demonstrating here in a moment, which kind of takes the step 2 and 3 and automates that and puts it back in the hands of the users as well as the system administrators, and both, hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate both of those aspects here for you. Okay, so let's talk specifically about MaxEdit. So MaxEdit, the premise of MaxEdit is that it's a utility that's built right into Maximo itself and can be launched from within Maximo through the Select Action menu. MaxEdit renames locations, asset job plans, companies, and others, and I'll hopefully be able to demonstrate this in a moment, and I believe I have a more elaborate list here on the next slide as to which records it can rename, and also there's also an offline tool, which I'll talk about in a moment as well, that actually allows you to rename any record in Maximo as long as you understand how that record is related to other records in Maximo. So the last was maybe a little bit of a cryptic statement, but because Maximo itself keeps track of its own metadata through the same as information, so if you're a Maximo administrator, this probably means something to you. MaxEdit relies on that information, and it will know to navigate that landscape to, once you update one record, it knows to update which other records to touch. Also, MaxEdit, assuming here that if you have custom objects and custom fields that you've created in your Maximo implementation, which is common, as long as you follow the IBM procedure and the best practices on how to create these custom objects and custom fields, MaxEdit can actually rename those records, or, for example, if you added a custom location field on the custom object, it will update that custom object as well, again, as long as you've created that custom object in the proper way that you should be creating that custom object. All right, so back to the features. As I mentioned, it's launched natively from inside Maximo, which means you can use the standard Maximo security controls and define who can and cannot perform the renames within Maximo. It renames, as I mentioned. This is a more elaborate list. So from the built-in tool within Maximo, these are the objects that you can rename online, as we call it. It also provides a dry run feature showing what would happen. And in a moment here, when I demonstrate this, you'll understand why this is important, because a single rename of a location or a person ID can affect a lot of data within your system. So the dry run would give you an indication as to what would happen if you do it before you would actually do it. As I mentioned, it identifies all records affected for a given rename. So if you rename a person, it will go out and update all the records that reference that person and a location and so on and so forth. Because it's built within the Maximo framework itself, it is installed just like any other IBM add-on is. It's upgrade aware, so once you, and we've had several customers since the early days of 7.1 and 6 that started running MaxEdit, and they, as they upgrade, the tool itself doesn't need to be upgraded. So it works just like you have an industry solution or an add-on installed in Maximo. The other thing I would mention here is that we have currently a very wide install base across many different industries, several geographies: North America, Europe, Middle East, Asia, and Africa. We have installs on this tool in a lot of on-premise, but also with the cloud-hosted, whether it's IBM hosted or others. They have gone through and vetted the products, and they would basically certify that it's okay to use inside these cloud-hosted systems as well. So the install base actually is for very large customers, and we have very small implementations out there as well. So it scales as well. So why would you consider using the tool versus not? So the pros of the MaxEdit tool is that it provides, typically what we see is you assign the right to use the tool to super users or business owners. So there's no requirement to go to the IT department or a third-party consultant to go and, hey, I have one location to rename or 2 locations to rename. They can just do it themselves. So the changes are also made consistently, so you're not rebuilding a script every time you need to make a change, which you would have to do. You have to be aware that if you have a script that was built in January and now you want to do a rename in June, and then maybe in the meantime you applied a feature pack or fix pack, you're going to have to revisit that script because there may have been new tables or new relationships introduced. MaxEdit is aware of these, and it will incorporate those changes, but a custom script you would have to take some due diligence on ensuring that it doesn't have to be updated. Of course, the con is it's an add-on, it's a tool. You have to buy it, you have to install it, and you have to maintain it. The online tool, so the tool that is can be exposed to super users or business owners, for safety reasons, it makes renames one at a time. So in other words, you open up a location, rename it. If you have 5 locations to rename, you have to open up 5 locations and give it a name. Now, you see there's a big asterisk there because one of the very common requests we get is, while we have more, this is less of a month-to-month, week-to-week thing. This is more of we actually have a project. We have an acquisition. We have a divestiture. We have something that forces us to rename a lot of locations or a lot of items. So the tool, we also have an offline version of MaxEdit that is a bulk utility. And in fact, that's how it grew up. It used to be a bulk utility, and then we turned it into an online utility. So this is basically, at its core as DNA, it always was able to do multiple renames. So we, as Ontracks, we use this extensively on upgrade projects or migration projects, and we've used it to carry forward or rename a vast volume of information or do a lot of renames. It is very scalable. Now, the downside is we do not, if you purchase a license of MaxEdit, by default you don't get it, because the first thing we want to do is make sure you have training on how to do that. So it's a small services engagement. It's not an additional software fee, but we do, it is mandatory to go through the training before we give you the offline tool, specifically because the tool is able to rename anything in Maximo, so you do have to understand some of the risks and limitations of why you would want to do that. Because it's built as a offline tool and it's built to be part of typically larger projects, it is a command line driven tool. You configure it using XML files. And in the demonstration, I'll walk through it in a very quick way. I'm not going to go into a lot of details there, but I'll hopefully have a chance to demonstrate this to you as well. Last but not least, before we get into the demo portion of the webcast, the online version is available as a 30-day trial. It is completely functional. It's the only limitation is that it will only work for 30 days. And of course, you'd have to run it on your development system. So it's available as a 30-day trial. It's a download off our public website. So usually what I find is the proof is always in the pudding. So if it's something you're considering, I highly encourage you to just go download it, talk to your administrators, have them download the tool and trial it out for free for 30 days, and then see for yourself if it's a fit for your organization or not. Okay, so I will switch to the demonstration side. I'll have to switch some screens, so your screen may be a little flickering. Let's see if we can get this going. Okay, so if I did this correctly, you should be seeing a Maximo login screen now. I'm going to be demonstrating this with Maximo 7.6.1. As I mentioned, we support all currently supported IBM versions of Maximo and all industry solutions and so on and so forth. So I'll be logging in this particular case, I'll be logging in as a user with a lot of elevated rights as an administrator. And for those of you familiar with Maximo, I'm sure this is going to look very familiar. So the first thing I want to demonstrate here is the fact that this is built right into Maximo. So I'll just go into the help and the system information, and as you can see, these are all the I have installed Maximo, installed in this case the Maximo Oil and Gas add-on, and then you can see at the bottom here that this is showing you that you have also the Ontracks MaxEdit tool installed as well. Secondly, I just want to highlight before we get into the tool itself is how you would administer the tool from a security perspective. So again, it's built right into Maximo. So if we go to the Maximo Security Groups application, this is the super user administrators are very familiar with this application. And let's say I'm opening up the maintenance group, and this is a group that we do not want to have the ability or provide the ability to rename this. So, for example, if I go to the locations application, which is one of the apps that MaxEdit supports, and then you see these are all the security rights granted to the locations. And if I go to search for rename, you'll see that it just shows up as a new security right that says rename location. And if I check this box, they will have access to it. If I uncheck it, they won't. And so, for example, my super users group has access to the rename location. Therefore, they would see it in their menu and be able to rename. Okay. So let's start out by doing what's probably the most common use case of MaxEdit, the locations application. So in this particular example, let's say we have a general breakdown for facilities maintenance location hierarchy. We have an office building. Within the office building, we have 4 floors. And once upon a time, we decided to create these locations with the naming convention of MO Floor 1, which is Main Office Floor 1. And we've decided, or we want to change that. We don't like that name anymore for whatever valid business reason that is. So I'll go into this location. And of course, what you notice is that location is part of the location hierarchy, of course. So it has child locations. It has assets at this location. If I go and look at the work details, I can see I have work orders at these locations, and I have PM records, and I have a route that lists this location. So the critical thing is that if I wanted to rename this location, I would have to make sure that all these relevant records, the route, the PM records, and the work orders, and anything else that's related to that location is also updated. And of course, as you may know, I cannot change this name here. So with MaxEdit, once that's installed, I can go on the left-hand side and scroll down. There will now be an entry that says Ontracks Rename Location, and this dialog box pops up. So on this dialog box, you would indicate that, hey, you know, I've asked my IT guys to make sure we have a backup taken just in case something goes wrong. I can check the box here that says, let's just do a dry run. I don't necessarily want to do it. I just want to see what will be impacted if I were to do that. And let's say we've decided that our new naming convention is going to be M-41. And then it would start the rename. I'll get a message saying, hey, the rename operation has started. And this list here will tell you exactly what's going on. First of all, it's going to tell us, hey, I'm not actually doing this. This is a dry run. It's pulling in the same as information or the metadata information for locations. And you can see it is going through every table in Maximo, which is a significant list that may or may not be impacted by this particular location. And if I go refresh, it's going to tell me it is completed. Now, it was a dry run, so it didn't actually do, so this location is still the same. So if I revisited that and said, hey, I'm okay with this change now, I'm going to do this change, I'll go back into the menu and I'll leave the dry run blank, click on and change it to M41, and then start the rename. And you can see it's going through this. I'll just refresh it, and it will tell me the rename operation has completed successfully. And if I now were to go back to this location, you see that it has renamed the location. It has kept it in the existing location hierarchy, of course. And for example, if I were to now go back to the Start Center, you can see that in my results set here, I had some work orders that were originally sitting at MO floor 1, and they have those work orders has been changed as well. So let's take a look at the work order application. And if I go now back to the drill down, you see that originally this was MO floor 1, it's now M41. And I can see that these work orders have also been changed to reflect the new location. This particular location also had a PM associated to that, so if I were to go back and look at this PM record, you can see that it as well is now referencing the M-floor location and no longer the MO floor 1 location. So one of the key things to understand is that once you go through MaxEdit and rename a location, it's as if the old location has never even existed in the first place. So it will go back and change every single record in the system to reflect that new location. Similarly, if I wanted to go, instead of a location, if I wanted to go rename a person, so that's also a very common use case we see. So if I were to go back to my Start Center, you see that the supervisor on this work order is set to NALBA, which happens to be a person by the name of Nancy. And in this particular case, if I'll let this, there we go. So this is Nancy Alvarez. A very common request or a common use case we see that, you know, in case of marriage or any other type of name change, of course, what Maximo will allow you to do is if I go to the person application and locate Nancy, I can, of course, change her last name to, for example, Smith, which will update her name, and maybe the IT department was okay and gave her a new email address as well. And, of course, I can save that. And what that will do is if I go back to my Start Center, of course, it hasn't changed Nancy, but the only thing it has changed, of course, is her full first and last name. So, but in a lot of cases, that is still not considered sufficient. So how can we rename this? Again, we would go back to the person application, find Nancy, and on the left-hand side, go Ontracks, rename person. I'm not going to do a dry run in this case in the interest of time, and let's say we're going to rename her to Nancy Smith, and start the rename. Now, you can see this list is actually absolutely huge in Maximo because the personal record can be used on a lot of fields. So if I just scroll through this and refresh, there we go. It's changed that name. There we go. So Nancy is now officially Nancy Smith. And you can see that now if I go back to my Start Center, that lead has changed from Alba to Nancy Smith. The last just high-level one I would show you, I'm not going to go through a full example, is a very common use case, is also company records. So if you have, for example, a list of company records like this, and you decide to go, well, we actually want to rename this, or we don't like the way it's named, or there's a typo in it, you see there's also a rename company, which would allow you to rename that company to a different name. So last part of the demonstration, what I wanted to demonstrate really quickly here is the bulk rename. So as I'm showing you here, I'm inside Maximo. Everything is, every change I make is one by one. But what if you have many different locations to change? So for that, I'm going to have to go and show you the offline tool. So for the offline tool, I'll share my desktop with you here. And what you should be seeing is just a regular desktop with a bunch of files on it. And one of the key things is that the offline tool gets installed as a command line utility. It is configured through an XML file. I don't want to scare the rest of the audience away if you've never seen this before, but I can guarantee you if your IT people are more than capable of navigating this. But this configuration file essentially tells MaxEdit how to connect to the database, what type of field to rename. You can specify specific where clauses. So in other words, we are going to rename all locations in this particular site or in this particular area. And there's many different options here. You can rename based on like a search and replace kind of action where you say replace all occurrences of this phrase or value with this other value. What we find is the most common request for location renames is just a simple spreadsheet where you would have, if I flip to that spreadsheet now, you would have, hey, I have all these locations on the left-hand side, and I'm just using 12 as an example, but it could be 12,000 or 120,000 or however many that would be. And then this is the new name that I want to give to those locations. So if I flip back to my my Maximo application real quick here, hopefully that catches up with you folks as well. If I go to the assets application and just pull down the locations application and pull down the first list, you see these are basically the first 12 locations in this list that we want to rename or reapply a new naming convention to. So on this, I would say we're going to change this to a dash location, and we're basically introducing a dash. All we'd have to do is build this spreadsheet. We would save that spreadsheet as a comma-separated file. Okay. All right, so to save this list, I would then go onto the command prompt, and I would tell MaxEdit to run that. So let's call it rename. This is the file I had open. So this is the configuration file. And the way the tool is built, it's built to be part of, perhaps a larger migration effort where you have maybe an upgrade tool or any other ETLs that are happening at the same time, so it could be scheduled to run, after hours or whatnot. You would obviously make sure the Maximo system is down or is not available to the end users, but if I were to run this, it will launch a new window and it will go through that spreadsheet and go line by line and rename all those assets. So if everything worked as I had hoped, if I now go back to Maximo and refresh this, then you can see that it has renamed all the first 12 or so from the old name to the new name. So that's it for the presentation part. I will go back to my slides now. Oops. So if you need any more information, obviously feel free to contact me. We also have a very detailed page on our website, which the link is showing right here. The last thing to mention is if you're interested in or have more information about the application, the best thing I can tell you is just use the evaluation download. Like I said, the proof is in the pudding. That allows you to try it out for yourself and see if it's a fit for your organization. So with that, Kat, we can probably open up the lines. If there's any questions that may be there, I will try to answer them.
Can you hear me, Frank?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay. Will MaxEdit update where clauses in queries and reports?
No, it does not. So that information is not captured in Maximo itself. So you will have to write queries to detect to see if those locations are used. Now, that would only affect those where clauses and queries where you have hard-coded the name of a location, an asset, or a site. But no, there's no way for MaxEdit to detect automatically that's there.
Is there dry run functionality in the multi-change, the multi-edit?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and the answer is yes, absolutely, yeah. So it's part of the XML configuration, and one of the configuration settings you can do is set dry run to true or 1, and that will perform a dry run. One thing I didn't show in my demonstration, but it is absolutely there, is there's a full log file that will capture not only the rename that's about to be done in a dry run, but also how many records would be affected by that dry run. So the dry run is a very useful feature in the offline tool as well.
Do we have any other questions? I can go ahead and open up the audio. You will need to make sure that you're muted if you did not want to let us hear your office chatter, but I'm going to go ahead and unmute the lines if anybody has a quick question.
We're going to pull everything into the room back there.
So if anybody has a question, please go ahead and speak up.
From here to the end of this building.
It doesn't sound like anybody is chiming in.
Okay.
Oh, you have a text that just came in. Does MaxEdit keep up to date with any and all other additional add-on modules?
Yes, I think the question is probably around if you have like an industry solution, and the answer is yes. It supports any data that is stored in Maximo. So very common ones that we work with is Maximo utilities, oil and gas, transportation, and our updates are independent of those. So you're free to update oil and gas. You don't have to go back and worry about MaxEdit in that case. So it's a good question, but yes, we fully support add-ons as well.
Do the edits appear in audit tables as other record edits do?
No, they do not. So as I mentioned, there's a big difference between the e-audit functionality in Maximo, which is a change to the everything but the key fields in Maximo. So the audit tables are updated, but they're updated in a different way. So as I mentioned, the best way to look at MaxEdit is if you rename a record, it is as if the old record has never existed. So all data is changed that reference the old record.
Does MaxEdit modify GL accounts and components?
Yes, it can. Yeah, you would have to do that through the offline tool, but it certainly can, and it's certainly actually that's a very good question because that is a common use case. It's common that MaxEdit is used in that context. Okay. Any other questions?
Hey, here we go. How much does the product cost?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not going to talk commercial terms over the phone line, but by all means, ping me a note, and I can send you more detailed commercial information on that. MaxEdit is licensed by environment, I guess I can say that, and then at its lower level, you at a minimum level you buy for 3 like your typical development, test, and production environments. We
do have a couple other questions that just popped up. What is the maximum number of records that can be updated in one run?
Unlimited. With the offline tool, it's unlimited.
And
of course, it's limited to the amount of CPU, and if you're renaming 1 billion records, obviously your systems need to be able to support, and your database needs to be able to support that, but the tool doesn't put any limitations on it.
Okay, and we've got one last question. Has this been used in any regulated implementations?
Yes, most certainly. Yes, yeah, both on the utility side, in the oil and gas side, and some other clients which I'm not allowed to disclose. But yeah, some very heavily regulated industries have used this tool.
Okay. Last question. Just snuck it under the wire here. Upgrading to 7.6.1 already have MaxEdit. Is this a new install of MaxEdit?
And well, technically yes, because 7.6.1 forces you to do a new install. This is not our limitation. This is the way IBM has released 7.6.1. So you just like you would have to create a new SMP folder with your Maximo install. So therefore, you'd have to reinstall MaxEdit just like you would for any other industry solution. Now that's probably the only exception. So within 7.6, for example, there were many releases done, and you wouldn't have to touch MaxEdit. But because 7.6.1 is a new install because of IBM's reasons, you would have to reinstall it. But you can, the way it works is if you have a license, all you need to do is take the same tool that's available freely on our website and rerun that install on the new SMP folder, and then you're good to go.
Okay, that's great. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Frank, thank you so much for the presentation. We will have this recording up on our website in about a day. If you have any other questions, please feel free to dash those off to myself or more effectively to Frank. And we thank you for your time.
Thanks, Kat.
Have a good day.